Welcome to Mentoring in Real Life, where we talk about what it takes to find and be a great mentor. I'm Angela, and together with my co-host Bill, we know the power of mentoring and what it can do in your life on both sides of the table. If you're interested in learning tips, tricks, and hearing stories about mentoring, you're in the right place. Come join us. Hey Bill, how are you today?
Angela, I've never been this happy. How about you?
I am tippy-tappy. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. Well, today I think we're going to talk about a favorite topic for both of us, and that's the importance of giving feedback. You know, no matter what the role is, feedback can be one of the most consistently difficult things that leaders do. You know, I think there are some that just avoid it altogether because they treat feedback as criticism instead of guidance, and conflict rather than caring about people. And even when the leaders do speak up, they may soften or delay the message. You know, they're sort of pulled back by the instinct that many of us share. It's sort of, you get reluctant to be the cause of somebody else being uncomfortable. And when you're the one giving the feedback, you're also watching that person's face fall as you're providing some feedback. And sometimes the weight of that feeling responsible for somebody else can make even some real confident leaders go quiet. Well, regardless, it's just critical to remember the importance of the feedback. If you as the mentor won't give your mentee feedback, who will? Also, if your mentee doesn't change the things that you're noticing, you know, that are clearly going to hold them back, or if they're just not aware of those behaviors or the lack of performance, you know, are you willing to watch them be passed up for promotions or opportunities? If you can help a mentee smooth out rough edges to be better at work, why on earth wouldn't you choose to do that? Feedback is just where a lot of mentoring relationships can either accelerate or they sort of quietly stall. And the difference usually comes down to how the feedback is delivered, not just what's said. A strong mentor is not just going to give feedback. They're going to create a psychologically safe process that helps the mentee use the feedback.
Absolutely. And this might be why our mentoring relationship lasted so long, Bill, because you weren't shy about giving me feedback. And quite frankly, it helped my career. It helped propel my career, right? Because there were blind spots that I didn't know I had that, boy, how you deliver that feedback was usually over a glass of wine, which probably helped soften
It only
it.
helped me.
But it certainly was still honest and transparent. And so thinking about that model, we created a practical, high-impact approach that all mentors can use to help give feedback to their mentees. And the first is really make sure you have their permission and give some context around the feedback. So for example, before giving feedback, align on intent with your mentee. Start with, can I share an observation that might help you with X, whatever the behavior is? Or would you like some quick feedback or deeper coaching on whatever the conversation is happening in real time with your mentee? So this does two things. The first thing it does is it reduces defensiveness on the part of the mentee. You're asking for permission to actually give them feedback before doing so. And the second piece is it gives the mentee some level of control. They can choose to say, no, I don't want the feedback from you, in which case that's a data point for you as a mentor. But usually the mentee will want the feedback and actually be open to the feedback. So by bringing it up and demonstrating your intent first and asking permission to the mentee, first you reduce the chance of defensiveness, and the second is you actually increase the openness that the mentee might have in receiving it. What's the next thing you would recommend?
Yeah, so just sort of building on that thought, you know, it's going to land a whole lot better if it's connected to what they care about. You know, when you're providing the feedback to them, you can remind them, hey, you know, you mentioned that you wanted to be seen as being more strategic. You know, so maybe these are some things you need to think about. Or since the goal that you stated is you want to lead larger meetings, then let's talk about how to do that and the things that you're doing or not doing right now that are going to help you in that direction. And so this just shifts the feedback from sounding like criticism as just simply supporting what they said is their ambition.
Yeah. And when you do that, there's a good way to remember you don't want to make this like personal. It's not a personal attack at all. And so by approaching feedback, think about three different components to it. One is the situation, one is the behavior, and one is the impact. So, with respect to the situation, when and where did it happen? The behavior, what is it that you observed? And make it fact based. And the third is, what did their behavior cause, or how was it perceived? So, as an example, you can say, in yesterday's leadership meeting, that's the situation, you jumped in quickly to solve the problem. That was a behavior. It helped move things forward, but it also limited others from contributing. That was the impact. So what you're doing is you're removing vagueness, you're keeping it objective, and you're not making it a personal judgment against the person.
Yeah, and so as you're engaged with them in this discussion, when you can see if you're the mentor, when you can see patterns and you can communicate those, that takes your role as the mentor to the next level, because you're seeing stuff that just may not be obvious to the mentee. I'm talking to somebody, a pattern I've noticed is you often step in way too quickly. And what leaders at the next level tend to do is X, and get into a whole conversation about how they might want to approach being in those kinds of conversations. So it just often is about helping the mentee recognize behaviors that seem to be repetitive that may be getting in the way of where they're trying to go.
Yeah. So we've talked about, first of all, model like situation, behavior, impact, and then also doing some pattern recognition. Bill, I think you're going to love the next recommendation that we have, because then the intent is for the mentor to stop and actually get curious. Don't assume you know the answers before understanding the other person's perspective. Don't rush to fix it. This is where it becomes a two-way conversation. And that invites reflection by the mentee rather than defensiveness. Does this remind you of any habit?
It seems to remind me of some habits I learned somewhere along the line. I think there were 7 of them. And I think habit 5 actually was seek first to understand and then to be understood. And so I know we've mentioned it in a number of podcasts previously. It just keeps coming back as a critical piece of being a good mentor, is making sure that you're trying to understand the situation, what the behavior is, why they're doing it, what their perspective is, before you're sharing what you think they ought to be doing about it.
Yeah. This is all part of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of Bill's favorite leadership tools. Mine too, of course, but certainly one that Bill loved enough that he took the class a number of times and then was an instructor for it a number of times, even at his most senior roles in the organization. And so by seeking first to understand and then be understood, or getting curious, you could ask questions like, how do you see the situation? What was your intention in that moment? And what would you do differently next time? And that gives the mentee an opportunity for reflection and then actually thinking about what it is that they would do differently and conveying that to you. That builds self-awareness, it builds ownership, and it also builds long-term growth for the person, where they're not just dependent on you to be the one consistently providing the feedback in how to change behaviors and what impacts those might have.
Right. And so as we build on this, clearly you want to be you want to give specific guidance with something that they could take some action on. You're trying to keep it practical. This is not ethereal discussion. If, for example, out of the previous discussion we had, if your mentee tends to dominate conversations, they jump in too quickly. Hey, mentee, maybe next time try pausing for 5 seconds before responding, because depending on the specific situation, silence can be a very powerful way to stimulate thinking and response from other people. Or you could ask a question before offering a solution, or consider framing your idea as a question to invite other people into the conversation. And so this avoids sort of saying, you dominate conversations, you just do something about that. You're trying to give them something that they could actually practice and, tie it to the behavior and look for different outcomes from making changes.
And when you do that and add on some ways that can help the mentee build momentum, things like, look, this is a very fixable skill. You're closer than you think. Or I'm giving you this information and this feedback because you're ready for the next level. That actually helps close the conversation with demonstrating confidence that you have in the mentee. This reinforces psychological safety, and it also reinforces a belief that you have in their capabilities to get to the next level.
Yeah, so we've talked about things to do, and maybe we should talk a little bit about maybe some common mistakes that we want to avoid along the path. We talked a little bit about it a second ago. You don't want to be vague, okay? And I got this guidance early in my life. You need to improve your executive presence. Okay, that's fabulous.
What does
Any
that mean?
ideas about that? Or do you want me to just sort of know that by osmosis? And so giving people practical advice and actual behaviors that they could try out is a much more productive way to approach the problem. You know, Also, as you're doing feedback and if you're doing recurring sessions with folks, when you're in those sessions, you don't want to overload them with, here's 1,000 things you need to be working on. I'd say maybe one or two key points per conversation. And in that conversation, I would suggest, just as you said a few minutes ago, you don't want to give the advice too early. You want to make sure that they get a chance to talk about what's going on. And, if you skip past the time for them to reflect on things, it's going to create a dependency of the mentee depending on the mentor to tell them what to do as opposed to working through some of the issues themselves. And, often the details of any given answer just don't come out without letting somebody work through the situation in their mind. And so it's just really critical to do some listening along this path. The other thing that sometimes you want to be very careful about, and we hinted this earlier, is avoiding making something personal. Stick to the behavior, not to their specific identity. It's certainly okay to identify tendencies that you see in the mentee and their behaviors, but you're just identifying behaviors and what you observed as the responses to those behaviors. That just makes it about getting things done in a better way and not about their personality.
Yeah. When you can make this a ritual, and you just alluded to it as well, like making it more recurring, that actually helps. That's really a pro tip when it comes to mentoring itself. So the best mentors don't treat feedback as occasional. They actually make it predictable. So, for example, they can say at the end of each time that we meet, we're going to spend 10 minutes on feedback both ways. I actually want to hear feedback from you as well. So that can give them an opportunity to give you feedback on your mentoring too, and you can model the behavior for your mentees. We're big fans of Manager Tools, which is a company that focuses on leadership development and so forth. And they recommend giving feedback in the form of one-on-ones on a weekly basis. Now, that's a ritual that we recommend for managers and direct reports, but we recognize that's likely not the right cadence or even the right format necessarily for a mentor-mentee relationship. A manager presumably witnesses the direct report's behavior on a regular basis, and that might not be the case with a mentor or mentee. But feedback is always a gift. And as regularly as possible, the mentee will reap the benefits of mentor feedback.
Absolutely. And so since we said we love those one-on-ones and Manager Tools teachings so much, well, maybe we could model something similar for the mentor-mentee relationship. So for mentees, you could leverage your monitoring conversations similar to a one-on-one. You could share the experiences you've had, maybe even ones that the mentor did not observe, and get feedback on that. Now, of course, that means being real honest with the mentor. Tell them what you said or what you did in some particular situation, even if it didn't go well. And I would say, particularly if it didn't go well. That's just a critical piece of this. If everything's going perfect, I'm not sure the mentor has to do too much. But the tough ones, the difficult situations, maybe that's the ones you definitely want to bring up in your one-on-ones with the mentor.
And this again goes back to, I think, why getting feedback from you during our mentoring conversations went so well. In that there were times that I gave you some very candid, remembrance of a difficult conversation that I had with a peer or even my leadership, and got your perspective on how to repair it, how to move forward. And it helped when you gave me feedback on how to approach it. Sometimes it was like, yeah, I needed to repair the relationship. I needed to do something about it. And then it also might have been that you gave me perspective that, you're just not going to jive with that person, and helped me choose to move on in my role or whatnot without them necessarily. That's okay too, to recognize that if I'm not jiving with the person, that it's okay for me to move forward. But what you did, Bill, was you gave me honest, candid feedback, because I was giving you, hey, this is what they said, this is what I said, and gave some pretty honest conversations about it, and got your feedback on, well, you might have done that a little differently, Angela.
Yeah. So I think a powerful tool, and people used it on me, so don't feel like the Lone Ranger and, gee, you might have wanted to do it differently sometime. The benefit of having a mentor being in that conversation with you is they can separate what really happened from what your perception is about what really happened. Because it's typically, it's likely that you're going to have a lot of emotion around the situation if it went poorly. And the mentor is going to be able to help you focus on just the factual side and help you develop a way forward. Frankly, the mentor's role really is never to dive into the emotional pool with the mentee, but rather help the mentee get out of the emotional pool and have a practical approach for how you affect different outcomes. So the other part that I want to add to this conversation about the one-on-ones, again, building on the discussion from the manager tools recommendations, we strongly recommend keeping handwritten notes for these discussions. In fact, we recently heard from a manager tools community leader who said they were required to keep some of their notes in a software tool, and suddenly that software tool is going to get sunsetted by their company without a data migration plan into a new tool. Now, fortunately, she also had handwritten notes from her one-on-ones that went back for years, and so she was able to seamlessly migrate with her notebooks, the manual data migration, somebody might say. And so we're very big fans of taking notes, taking handwritten notes, and making sure you're keeping a track of that on both sides, both mentor and mentee.
When we heard about this situation that happened with this manager tools community member, you and I had a conversation about why does it feel so different when we're having a conversation with somebody, or we're giving a briefing or whatnot, and they're handwriting notes versus the person that has their computer open, their laptop open, or maybe they're sitting behind their desk and typing away. And why is it so different? And you and I had a conversation about that. And again, we always recommend handwriting notes. And the reason is, first of all, when someone is typing, their eyes are usually on the screen. They're not on you. Their body's turned towards the computer, not towards you. And so you think to yourself, they're not here. They're not fully with me. They're distracted. And so when you're handwriting, however, you can keep your body oriented towards the person who's speaking. Your head's down briefly as you're taking a note, and then you're back up and looking at the person and making eye contact. And so it feels like you're engaged. Even if the person who's on their computer is really just taking notes, it still doesn't feel that way to the speaker. And so when you have a laptop between you and the person that you're talking to, you think, like, are they actually taking notes? Maybe they're checking emails, maybe they're multitasking, but you can't tell. And so our brains tend to fill in the gap, often negatively. But if they're writing, they're writing. You know that they're taking notes on that. And so one piece of that too is, like, when I know when I take notes in a meeting, when I'm typing, I am actually just capturing the notes and the things that I'm hearing from the meeting versus if I'm writing things down, because that's a slower process. I have to process and summarize and write things down versus just capturing notes in, typing them. And so that's another piece too, is that when you're handwriting, you're able to process what the other person is saying in a much more effective way. So the last thing too is I've read this book, and I honestly can't remember what the name of the book, but it talked a lot about body language and how to interpret body language by other people. And this person the author of the book had been in the FBI, and so knew a lot about interrogation techniques and all of that kind of thing. And one of the pieces that I remember is that when you have something like a screen or a big old water bottle like what I have here next to me, when that is between you and the other person that you're speaking to, it actually creates a barrier. So consciously or not, that barrier actually can close down conversation. Whereas when you have nothing between you, and I don't remember the author saying it in these words, but I almost imagine it like when your chests are, facing each other without anything between them, then you can be much more open and be much more receptive. Have you ever experienced anything like that, Bill, when you're faced with someone typing while you're engaging with them? What's
You-
that been like?
You're kidding, right? We worked at an IT organization. I was faced with that regularly, with people constantly being on their computers. And so we got to the place where, depending on the nature of if we're trying to solve some technical problem and they're working through tools, that's one thing. If we're trying to have, well, certainly in a in a mentoring conversation, I pretty much said, I don't want your laptop open. Okay, if you want to take notes with a pad and paper. Some people were reluctant to do that, but I still was a little bit hard over about it because I had had the experience. I had let people be typing in times previously and found that when they were typing, they were not listening as well. And I don't know if they were multitasking, just like you suggested. There might have been other stuff going on. And they're looking at the computer, and it as you said, it is a real barrier, and it in fact changes the nature of the body language, which is a significant portion of the conversation. It's a significant portion of communicating. And so if they're just hunched over a laptop typing, they're not being expressive and they're not really sharing with me, and they're less engaged. There were a number of times when I would say something and say, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I was typing. It's like, okay, please stop typing so that we can actually have this conversation because it's that important. And so I eventually got to the place where I said, I'm sorry, we're going to close up the laptop and we're just going to talk to each other. I would encourage you to take handwritten notes, but I don't want you typing while we're in this conversation. It just got too hard. And I for a while used to think that it was a generational thing. Oh, Bill, you're the old guy, so you don't want to be on the laptop. No, I actually want the person engaged in the conversation, looking at me at least occasionally, and totally engaged in what we're talking about, rather than just taking notes.
Yeah. So take notes. Keep the laptop, keep the computer away. Get away from your desk. Don't have any large water bottles or any large, objects between you and the other person speaking to help open up the conversation. And really just summarizing everything that we talked about today. The first thing we recommend is mentors get permission from your mentees to give them feedback, right? Ask them, can I share an observation with you? Can I give you some quick feedback? Make sure you anchor that feedback to their goals. They've already told you what they want to work on. So when you give them feedback that aligns to what they care about, then that really helps the mentee be more open to it. Talk in ways that you talk about the situation, the behavior, and the impact. And when you do that, then also if you can provide patterns and demonstrate pattern recognition about some behavior that you've noticed with the mentee, that helps tremendously and takes the mentoring relationship and just propels it even further. And then get curious. Stop and wait and ask some questions about what the other person interpreted in the moment, how they saw the situation so that you can start understanding their perspective before you offer specific, actionable suggestions. And then when you offer these suggestions, close that conversation with some confident statements. Things like, this is fixable. You're closer than you think to getting to that next level. And that really helps reinforce your belief in them. We also talked about mistakes that mentors should avoid. So don't be vague. Don't overload the feedback. Don't give advice too early. And don't make it personal. All of those things will help detract from the conversation rather than add to it. And then when you're able to, treat feedback as a ritual rather than just occasional. And that makes it more predictable to the individual. Anything I missed there, Bill?
I think you got it all, Angela.
I missed something, actually. We actually created a cheat sheet for mentors to use in giving feedback to mentees. So if you'd like a copy of this tool, feel free to send us an email and we'll be happy to send it your way. Anything else, Bill?
I think you got it all now. So with that, thank you for listening to this episode of Mentoring in Real Life. If you have thoughts or questions, feel free to leave us a comment or send us an email, which we've included in the show notes. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, rate the podcast, and share it with a friend. Until next time, help others climb.